Last week I showed you a video of altering the pattern and adding these kind of horizontal wavy color blocking lines. As I said last week, they don't have to be color blocking. You could use them to do different textures or even just as plain style lines. You could add some piping into them for like a pop of color or something like that. And as promised, today we're going to go over how to sew it. It is a little bit challenging to sew, I'm not going to lie to you, but it's not impossible. I definitely made it harder on myself by using this polyester crinkle chiffon. It was just what I had on hand, and also I wanted to be able to see the style lines really clearly through it, and be able to share with you the comedy of errors that using chiffon would produce. So looking at the finished half scale, it looks really good. There are some crinkles here, like I said, from using the chiffon and stretching it out. And also you can see this line. I didn't clip the curves very well before I top stitched, so you've got kind of some wavy lines. If you were making this as like a garment, you may choose to either do contrast color stitching or to do the steps in a different order so that you can switch your thread out and do like all the green top stitching, all the black top stitching, for example. Those are design decisions that you can make. It's kind of one of the things that I love about making my own patterns or doing something without instructions, because once you know the steps, you can decide how to alter them. So I'm really only going to show you putting in a couple of the panels just because it's very repetitive, and once you understand what I'm doing, watching it happen over and over just isn't that exciting. So yeah, I hope that you like it. So getting started, you can see that, as I said before, I have my panels with my fabrics sitting next to each other, on top of each other. That way I'm not missing any pieces. They seem like they match up together when they're flat, but once I flip it over, you can see where the curves are complete opposite, and that means that I'm gonna need a lot of pinning. I don't usually use so many pins. When I was working on a production floor, pins were frowned upon and also very hard to find. So I usually don't use a lot of them. I was kind of trained out of it. But on something like this, they're really, really important. What I'm doing is I'm matching up the ends and the peaks of the curves. That way you'll see when I'm doing the in-between parts, I can kind of hold my pins so that my fabric is taut. And then I'm using my fingers to kind of wiggle the curves into place, and then pinning in the middle of them. And then if when I pull it taut, one layer goes underneath the other, I might put another pin there. It results in a lot of pins. I usually don't use this many, like I said, but on something like this, especially with such a slippery fabric that I'm using, they are very, very helpful once I get to the sewing machine. The concept is very similar to kind of easing in a curve. So if you have ever sewn on a sleeve and you're kind of pulling and there's more sleeve than armhole, you're kind of tugging everything and easing it in. It allows for more movement. In our case here, we're trying to prevent stretching either panel very much. As you can see, it happened a little bit, mostly because this fabric is so thin and it's not sturdy, so it stretched and pulled some. You can see at different angles when the light hits it. There we go. You can see where it stretched a little bit. It's going to be somewhat unavoidable on a fabric like this because it's very thin structure. You can see each thread, so it's very easy to manipulate things on accident. But if you're using a tighter weave, it shouldn't be as big of a problem if you are being very careful and pinning very carefully. So I'm kind of adjusting things, making sure that my pins are within my seam allowance area, so that once I get to the machine, I'm not having to do too much moving around. You'll see that I still do some work. I'm then pinning this to the wrong side. Oh, yes. Okay, there we go. We're back. I'm pinning it to the original pattern piece. It doesn't have to be the original pattern piece, but the reason I'm doing that is to stabilize the fabric on the machine. So I use this kind of see-through, it's like doctor's office paper basically for my pattern making. And when I'm sewing a thin fabric like this, my machine is going to eat the fabric. It's just going to go right into the hole where the bobbin is and make a big mess. So I use this to stabilize it, and then you'll see me rip it out afterward. As I'm sewing, I'm trying not to remove my pin until I have it so it's almost about to slip under the needle. I'm not supposed to sew over pins, of course, but in this case, I'm getting as close as possible because I want my presser foot to be holding that fabric still before I release my security, basically. I'm also, you can see right there, I left the needle in and I lifted the foot a little bit to release the pressure on the fabric, because the presser foot, when it's pushing down, is kind of pushing the fabric so that it bunches up in front of the foot. By lifting the foot, I'm releasing that pressure, but I'm also letting the fabric move. So I have to use my fingernail. On a heavier fabric, I would use a seam ripper to like poke and pull the layers back together. Okay, I'm having to adjust my pins to make sure they don't move. I'm also, you can see where like some things are still getting crinkled. So I'm using my snips to clip the curves as I sew. That allows things to move so that they're more in a straight line on the once they're going through the foot. So I just keep stopping and starting. I'm going very, very slowly. I even have this video in double time, so I'm going very, very slowly just to make sure that I don't make myself really upset later. You can see underneath, my bottom layer is getting bunched both vertically and horizontally. So when there's a curve, your bottom fabric is going to want to like, get all crinkled up. So you want to make sure that you're pausing to pull it back down. The top fabric isn't as much of a problem because your hand is holding it still. So it's the bottom, and you can see there that crinkle just is underneath, and now there's a horizontal one, and I'm using my pin to kind of push it out of the way. I'm using my fingers to push that excess fabric behind the foot so that the foot can't grab it anymore. Some of those will get caught in your stitching sometimes too, even after you push the fabric behind the foot, and that can be ironed out, but you really don't want to rely on that possibility too heavily. So you can see I had to lift my foot up there to release another one of those little wrinkles. And yeah, I'm just going very slowly. As I get to the end, I'm trying to make sure that I'm stretching the panel so that they're meeting at the same point, because I don't want to end up with a jagged edge on my side seams. And there we go. Okay, you can see it looks a little wonky, but at the end, because of the way that I pulled on the fabric, I've lifted my foot and I pulled, but I pulled too hard. So I made a jagged line. So you need to be really careful of that when you are lifting your foot. You're just releasing the pressure. You're not pulling on anything. Now I'm tugging that paper out of the way. It rips pretty easily, and I can just take it right out. And then some little bits get stuck in the actual stitches. You want to be careful not to tug it like this. You don't want to rip it like this. You want to pull it either side out as if it were perforated, because essentially you did just perforate it. Now I am clipping my curves very heavily. I'm clipping every centimeter, half inch or so. stitching right up to the stitching line. That way I'm allowing again, that pressure to be released as I flip the panel back over. And clipping all my excess threads as well. So I'm gonna top stitch these rather than press them open. As I top stitch, I'm kind of stretching. I'm pulling open the seam and tucking the seam allowance underneath where I'm top stitching. So it probably would be more clean if I was able to press it open and then top stitch, but on these tiny curves, especially being half scale, that's not going to work. So you can see where you can kind of see the stitched lines between the two panels. I'm pulling, and trying to stay as straight and close to that seam as I can. When top stitching, see on this panel, you may not be able to tell very closely in the camera, but it looks a little wonky because I didn't clip my curves well enough. So my top stitching ended up kind of wonky because I wasn't able to pull the panels apart very cleanly. So now I'm using these little duckbill scissors to clip off my seam allowances. If you're not using a sheer fabric, you can just leave them under there, unless it's very drapey and it causes you bulk. It's really a choice thing. Because I can see them through, it was upsetting me, so I cut them. These little scissors, the duckbill part allows you to kind of push the fabric out of the way while you're cutting, or like the underneath fabric. That way you're less likely to cut a hole through it. They're really, really nice. And I'm also using my finger to push the seam allowance out and make it more available for my scissors to cut really closely. Snipping my threads, making a mess, getting all the pieces off. Okay. So now I will press the panel as hard as I can, depending on the fabric, and try and get it flat. So now we're doing the next panel. We're doing this one. I decided to work from the top or from the bottom up because I want to touch this panel the least possible. I don't want any chance of stretching this out, and the more that I handle the more delicate parts, the more likely they are to stretch out. So I'm working from the bottom up. I'm not going to show you sewing every panel because it's extremely repetitive, and at some point you really can't tell what I'm sewing. They're just random curves. So see here, I started pinning it to the paper just so that I was making sure the top of that curve was pretty straight, and then I'm keeping the paper underneath as I sew. So going here, again, you can see here how close I let those pins get before I pull them out, and pulling carefully on this, making sure that these like edges where the curves make it seem like there's, you know, excess fabric, pushing those so that they land underneath my seam allowance, so they land underneath my presser foot before they start to push, because the presser foot as it's pushing down will push those excess fabrics in front of itself, and you really don't want that. So once I'm done, I'm pulling all the little papers off, clipping my curves, and now you can see I have all my panels together. I'm gonna go ahead and press them as hard as possible. This is a polyester chiffon, so I'm using medium heat and pressing them just so that they're as straight as possible. Now pressing my front panel. You can see, like I said, where some got stretched out, so I'm just making it as firm as possible. You can also see here a lot better where my top stitching is kind of a mess on this line. So it's just a warning to make sure you're clipping really well and being very careful, especially if you're using contrast top stitching. It's going to show very dark here, I'm just pinning my side seams together so that I can make a full dress panel. What I like about doing something on my own, like without instructions, is that I can decide what order to do the steps in. Once I know what all the steps are, I can decide to sew all the panels together and then sew all of my black top stitching and all of my green top stitching, or however you want to do it. So you can see here I'm using the paper just under my side seam edge. That way I don't get my seam eaten by the machine. My machine has a really hard presser foot. It has a dual feed, so the bottom and the top get fed at the same rate, but it presses down pretty hard. So that's why my chiffon always gets eaten. And I don't like having to pull it out of my machine with tweezers. Now, just pressing my side seams open. I want my side seams as flat as possible so that when I combine my shell, the outer layer, with the lining, it's not like bunching up on the side. So now I've done my lining off camera. I've done the side seams, so now I just have a full body where the shoulders are open. This next part, the last part really, is the most valuable information that I could ever give you in this video. It has nothing to do with the panels. It is this armhole like neckline situation. So what I'm doing is I am going to sew the back neck from the center back all the way up the shoulder seam allowance. As you can see, I pinned so that I could get that whole curve. And then the front neck, I'm doing the same thing from the center front, well, all the way around continuously. I'm sewing with right sides together, the lining in the shell, all the way up. I'm gonna go up my seam allowance and on the shoulder seam. So all the way up here to here. And then on my back seam, all the way around. The way that I do this, I learned when I was doing alterations, and it's way easier than trying to do a burrito method and or do it by hand. I really like this. So now I'm pinning my center of my armhole together. It's still right sides together, of the lining and shell. And then I'm pinning kind of halfway up the armhole in the front and the back. So I'm only sewing from here to here. Okay, so you can see, pinned there. And then I'm just stitching it together. You can see this ends up with the cleanest finished armhole, in my opinion, that you can get without trying to hand stitch everything. So we're going to sew the back neck shut, well, together. I didn't add a zipper to this or hem it because it is just a sample. Those things, the zipper instructions are on the package, and a hem, you really just fold it under as many times as you want after marking it. So because it's a half scale, I did not spend all the time doing that, especially because this chiffon would have been a nightmare to hem. After handling it so much, it's very frayed, and I just didn't want to end up with a t-shirt sized dress. So after I did that back seam, I clipped the curves and then I understitched, which means that I sewed the seam allowance to the lining. It's essentially the same thing as top stitching, but you're sewing it to the lining instead of the outside, and it keeps your lining tucked underneath so that it's not like winging out on you. Especially you can see it around the front neck, how the lining, it lays very, very flat. Now you can see me sewing my armhole. Again, I'm only sewing the lower half of the armhole. Losing my light. And cutting out kind of V-shaped clips to reduce bulk in my armhole, get my clips a little closer. And just making sure that I have the best chance of getting this like really nice clean curve by reducing the bulk with the V-shaped clips, you're taking fabric out so that when it's cut or when it's flipped over, you don't have it bunching on you. So now I'm understitching. Again, I'm only understitching the part that I sewed. So at this point in the video, it's here to here. You can't see it because it's like very similar in color, but I'm just understitching this part again so that my lining is staying tucked back under my armhole and never like starting to bunch out while I'm wearing the garment. Ooh. Okay, so we're understitching. The neck, we're doing the front neck, yes, we're doing the front neck. So you can see I'm starting on my front neck from the seam allowance up here, and just going straight all the way around. The reason that I do it this way, some instructions, even some of my own patterns instructions, have where you're doing the opposite. You're sewing the full armhole and then doing this halfway stitching on the neck and the back neck. However, I feel like I want to do my neck seams first so that they're very, very sturdy and they're not being compromised in any way or stretched out. So I do the full stitching on the necklines first. The reason people do it opposite is so that your outer shoulder doesn't show any sort of error, but I really think it's more important that the neckline, because it's the first thing that people see, that the neckline is like clean as possible. So you can see here we've got front neckline, armhole, yeah, front neckline, armhole, and the back neck. So we've got these open parts on the outer shoulder, and I'm going to sew my shoulder seam of my shell and my lining as one continuous straight shoulder seam. So at this point, these two layers are out. They're not connected here. This is my open part right here. They're out, and I'm matching up my high neck point and then pinning everything together. It's kind of hard to tell what I'm doing here on screen, because once everything, you're like bunching up all of this shoulder fabric and it kind of looks like nothing. You're like, where is this? So it's this seam and this seam that I'm sewing together, connected by this seam here. So just pinning all of that together carefully. The reason I'm using pins here, even though it's a straight seam, is because I want to make sure that that center point matches, and also that the rest of this fabric stays out of my way once I get to the machine. So now we have it stitched, and we just have this opening. Once I shove it back through, I just have this opening on my outer shoulder, and like a lot of bulk in my seam. So if this were a bigger piece, I would press the seam open on my handy dandy ham. Okay, I would use it to kind of push the armhole over and then press the seam, the shoulder seam open. But since this is so small, it was really hard to get it. So I just ended up clipping off the bulk of the seam allowance. If you're doing this as an alteration or as a gift for someone else, if you press open that seam, you can leave quite a bit of seam allowance in there for any alterations. On the shoulder seam, I used to leave about an inch just in case the dress needed to be altered again or there was a mistake. So you can leave a lot in there, and it just gives the shoulder kind of like a stabilization. Clearly on this fabric that wouldn't work because you can see it, you can feel it, it's, you know, very bunchy, but on like a cotton dress, you can leave quite a bit under there for later alterations if need be. So now what I'm doing is I'm going underneath in the front and I'm pulling that seam through. So you can see now that I've pulled it between the layers, I can sew it right sides together again. That way I'm not having to roll everything up inside. I honestly don't even know how the burrito method works. But what I'm doing is I'm just pulling it through the lining, pulling it out, and then I have the whole thing together. So I do have some fabric. You can see that there's some fabric bunched up in between there that I'm having to like push out of my way. But yeah, it's really easy. So now I am pinning my outer edge of my shoulder seams together and getting as close to where I stopped understitching. So I stopped understitching right before, like 2 stitches before where I stopped sewing. So you can see if I'm not careful I can get a pucker there, but I didn't. So now that it's sewn together, I have this weird looking tube inside my dress, and I just pull it all out. And now I have a clean finished shoulder that I just have to press, and it's done. Isn't that so easy? It's definitely the most important part of this video. I mean, the sewing the panels together, once you get it, you get it. But doing that armhole is a huge lifesaver for making any sleeveless dress, so you're welcome. I hope that you enjoyed this video and the sewing process with me. I really want to know if you try this. If you want to send me pictures on Instagram, I'll leave the link below. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them for me. I love to read them. I will be happy to talk you through any part that's confusing or explain it more in detail if I can. So I hope you have a great day. I will see you next week. My spouse wants me to inform you that I do in fact own other sweaters. It's just cold today and this happens to be my favorite one. Don't judge me. I swear it's clean. It just cycled back through over the course of the week. Don't judge me.